unmuted. I've almost shared my screen. It's streamlined this. Hello, everybody. Absolutely delighted to be here and to kind of open up Imagine If conference this year. I'm sure none of us were sat kind of 12 months ago in that wonderful venue. Those of you that had joined us in Newcastle at Hancock, thinking, do you know what? Imagine if next year we're going to be doing this virtually. I don't think any of us would have been considering that. But anyway, here we are, and I'm really, really pleased to be here, as I say, to open up and start this week of fantastic sessions, essentially by talking about and sharing what we have found at Children North East and with some of our friends from Newcastle University and the North East Child Poverty Commission, and what the experience of children and young people has been over the course of the last kind of 12 months, but more specifically 8 months since the pandemic has taken hold. So as Mel said, my name's Luke Bramhall. I'm the School Research and Delivery Service Manager at Children North East, and there is an activity, a task, you might say, to start us off. And the task is this: with your pen and paper, it's not a difficult one, by the way. With your pen and paper, can you please write down what you think, as an individual or as a professional, in fact, what you think the 3 most important things for children and young people are right now. So you have 30 seconds to do this, so not a lot of thinking time. I've started the timer. So write down, what do you think the 3 most important things are for children and young people right now? Not an easy question. 30 seconds is up. It disappeared. I need the countdown timer, but I couldn't manage to work that one out virtually. The 3 most important things. Now, your second part of this task is choose one that you think is maybe the most important, or if you can't decide, just one of those that you've written, and stick it in the chat. It's just going to be fascinating to see what we think the 3 most important things are for children and young people right now. In this current world and current climate. I've done the activity myself because that's important. What did I think? Well, I thought 3 things, and actually I've talked about these an awful lot since we've gone into lockdown way back in March, and these are the things that have kind of come to mind that I think as I say, as an individual and as a professional, are really important. So anxiety, re-socialization, because there's been a lack of opportunity for children to mix with each other, and supporting children with loss and loss, whether that's loss of a family member, whether that's loss of kind of learning because you've not been at school, loss of opportunities to engage with friends, etc., etc. So there's some of some things that I think. And I think what's really interesting, and the reason actually why we're starting this whole conference with this kind of these findings, or the findings that I'm going to share with you today, that it's all very well us thinking and knowing, and actually the things that we've got there in the chat, some of them you'll be absolutely on point, and some of them will be really kind of aligned with some of the things that we found from children and young people. But what's really important is that we don't kind of make assumptions around what we think is important. The people that we really need to speak to find out what is most important is, of course, children and young people. So I tested this theory on my 7-year-old son. So let's see how I compare to what he thinks are the 3 most important things. He's a clever lad, I would say that. But he said the 3 most important things for children and young people right now: first of all, wearing face masks, sanitizing hands, and keeping safe from the virus. How wonderful that he's much more practical than I am. How great. Secondly, and this is quite possibly my favorite, having fun. I wonder how many of us put on our list having fun, the importance of play, the importance of enjoyment and excitement. And then third, of course, having lots of nice food and staying healthy. Not only is he practical, he's current. You know, there's been lots of debate over the last week in the news, of course, around free school meals and providing support for, and some amazing things done within our communities in the Northeast to support children so they don't go hungry. My son's ahead of the game. He recognises already that that's an important thing for children and young people right now. But how important it is that we go and we speak to and we listen to children and young people. And just wanted to make that point. Because that is what's going to run throughout, and I'm going to repeat myself on that point, over the course of the next 50 minutes. I warn you now. Children Northeast. I mentioned earlier that I am from Children Northeast. We are, for those of you that don't know, the oldest regional charity in the Northeast. And we've existed a long time. In fact, next year is our 130th anniversary. I want to stress that I believe one of the core factors of our longevity, if you like, is the fact that the centre of everything we do is the voice and experience of children and young people. That's absolutely core. And if you look into all the work that we deliver, that's central. Not only that, it's central on our logo. You see our our fictional young person, Hope, in the centre of our logo. The voice of children and young people is at the heart of what we do. So, of course, this is really important and a really important subject and topic for us as a charity. So, okay, over the next 50 minutes, let me be clear on what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to very quickly, over the next 5 or 10 minutes, just bring a context to kind of what we know factually. What do we know that children and young people have experienced or are experiencing currently through this pandemic? Then I'm going to spend a good chunk of time thinking about the voice of children and young people. What is it that children and young people are talking about? What are they saying, and how have they kind of coped with this situation? But it's no good me just kind of, you leaving here in 50 minutes and saying, oh, well, that was really interesting, or, oh, that point really made me think, and all those kind of things. Actually, what's really important is that voice leads to a response. So I really want you to consider the voice of children and young people, how that can impact and influence what you do within your organizations. Whether you be a charity, a cultural organization, a school, whatever, a health setting, whatever organization you're from. It's really important that we allow the voice of children and young people to challenge us and so that we can learn from it. So that's our journey that we're going to go on over the next little while. And as Mel said, there's some very short breakout groups. I'll come on to them a little bit later, and also some tasks. So don't get rid of your pen and paper yet, because I've got some more questions for you to come. So let's think about context. I've put a picture of Hope in the centre there. As our young person, but what have children and young people experienced? Well, we know that they've experienced, back in March the 20, whatever it was, a national lockdown. We know we then came out of lockdown, and then we went into local lockdown, and then we went into tier 2, and there was talk of us going into tier 3 or maybe a firebreaker. We've ended up in a tier 4, another national lockdown. It's a complicated picture, isn't it? And one that we're all trying to navigate through. And just in the same way that we find that difficult, we know factually that children and young people will equally be struggling with the changing picture of changing kind of landscape that we're in. We know that there has been limited schooling, certainly from the end of March through till early September. Many children and young people didn't go to school, as in physically into the building. We're doing homeschooling. Some did go to school, and schools we know were open for key worker children and those vulnerable children, many of whom didn't access school. So we know that happened. The digital divide. We know that there is some issues around this notion of digital divide. Some children and young people do not have access to IT equipment. Okay, we know that to be the case. In fact, we've been doing some work with Newcastle Local Authority, who, for example, as one example in the Northeast, found at the beginning of lockdown way back in April, that 6,000 children and young people within Newcastle local authority did not have access to a digital device. And we know from other research that 7% of children and young people have intermittent access to the internet, and in fact 2% have no access to internet at all. And I particularly think of some of our more rural areas that may well be the case, especially. We know there's been restrictions on normal activities, and I just want to pull up a couple of other key kind of facts and important things for us to consider. Household incomes have been hit, whether that's as a result of the furlough scheme, and so households only having 80% of the kind of finances coming into the home. We know that businesses generally are not making as much money, particularly in some sectors. In terms of household income, what's really interesting is that going into lockdown, again back in March, 71% of North East children lived in houses with little or no savings. So you can then imagine the wider impact of the furlough scheme being only 80% and the other redundancies and such like. And something else that I think is really important for us just to touch on, thinking of a North East picture, is that lower earners are 7 times as likely as high earners to work in a profession that's been shut down. And we know that over the next month, as we've just found out over this weekend, that many of those sectors again will be shut down. And that's something really important that we consider and are aware of, because that very much feeds into a North East picture. Unemployment rates pre-COVID-19, we had the highest rates as a region in the country. 15% of 18 to 25-year-olds unemployed, 5.2% of all ages unemployed. So again, we know that the wider impact of unemployment is impacting on children. I need to make sure that we keep coming back to that. These are all things that, okay, unemployment, it may be parents that are unemployed or that are being made redundant or that are furloughed, but that is having an impact on children and young people. And of course, poverty and the impacts of poverty. Over a third, 35% of our children in our region are suffering the effects of poverty. And we know that there's significant consequences of that. We have the highest rates of free school meal take up in the North East, proportionately. And again, research says that children in our region are more likely to go without a range of basics. So poverty significant, and we can't kind of ignore it. So I'm giving you kind of a picture. What is it that Hope's kind of, as a young person or child in the North East, what's her kind of current picture here and now? So that's the context. And that's, as I say, there's lots in there about facts and statistics, but what's the experience? And that's what we need to know. And what we want to understand is what's the experience of children and young people currently in the North East. And so I'm going to kind of share what it is that we found. But before I do that, again, I have to kind of make sure you're clear on what we've done to find this information. So very early on in lockdown, I had conversations with kind of the wonderful team from Newcastle University, including Liz Todd, Lydia Wysocki, and Lucy Tiplady. And we had discussions about the fact, I mentioned it at the beginning, that we really need to know what it is that children and young people are experiencing, so that we can best respond, so we can allow that to inform the decisions that we as organisations make on the support that we offer children and young people. So we designed this, for the purposes of this, affectionately called CNE Voices. And it has 2 phases. So phase 1 is a wider engagement where we ask children and young people to use pictures and words to answer 3 core questions. So these are kind of much more general kind of core questions. What have you found difficult recently? What's been good recently? And what's important for you now? And they're purposefully asked in such a way that it's kind of, can be answered by a wide age range. And then moving into phase two, and phase two being, you know, absolutely about meaningful conversations that can inform our thinking, can inform our understanding of that experience. And these are the kind of thematic areas that we ask questions under. So that's work. And so from July, we were carrying out this research, and I'll be sharing some of the findings from that. And it's not even completed yet. So I'll come on and explain a little bit more about that as well, and how we're kind of mopping up some of that, certainly some of that phase two element, but still got lots to share today. But in addition, we have also looked at what else is out there. You know, we've spoken to some children and young people as Children North East, but there's also other universities and organisations that have equally carried out research. So we've gathered information from our poverty proofing COVID response, speaking directly to children and young people about their experiences at school. Rob McDonald and his team from Huddersfield and Durham universities have done a piece of work, Youth Under Lockdown, and actually we're going to see a video from that work very shortly. Lockdown Life NE, which is again Newcastle University linked to the ARC, did some research into the experiences of children and young people. So we wanted to, you know, it's not just about what we've gathered, we wanted to get a full picture of what it is that children and young people are experiencing. And in addition, got a literature review, kind of completed literature review around some of these other research studies that have been carried out by the people mentioned here. So just to give a flavour of this, there's lots of kind of different pieces of work that have gone into this, and it's not just ours, along with Newcastle University. So that's kind of what we've done. And you're probably sat there thinking, right, come on, Luke, tell us what they said then. You know, tell us what we need to know, you know, from children and young people. And I will come on to that. But before we do, again, we've got to be really clear about why that's important. So I've written 3 questions here. This is your next, I want to say this is a test. It's kind of somewhat ironic, I guess. You know, this is your test on kind of why the voice of children and young people is important to you. So you have this time, I'll give you a minute and a half to just think. And I actually, if you can, I'd like you to write down an answer to these 3 questions. Not least because you could probably just say, yeah, it's important just because it's important and things like that. I want you to think about what that response might be. Why is it important to you in your organisation to hear the voice of children and young people? So I am going to set the timer going and just a minute and a half, get some ideas down, and then we'll come into some of the feedback. So the good news is I'm not going to mark your test. In fact, nobody is. But I think it's really important that we engage with this in such a way that we are allowing the voice of children and young people to influence our thinking and our decision making. And actually, we need to be clear about what where we're at on that journey. Are we willing to really kind of do that, and how? And this is a point in time, and I'm going to be sharing some views from children and young people. And it's important you read the note at the bottom there, actually, that and I'll just come on to that in a little bit in a bit more detail. But let's think about what we can do and why this is important. So as we move into some of the findings that we've had, I just want to kind of reiterate what Mel said at the beginning, which is around the questions in the chat. We have some wonderful people from both Children North East and Newcastle University who've been part of this work. So if you do have a question specifically related to some of the things that I may mention or talk about, then they'll be able to respond to that in the chat rather than waiting for me to answer at the end. So that's easier. So if you do get a response from Gwen or Georgina or Lydia, then you're in good company, and listen to what they're saying, because they'll have some great insights. So please do use that. So I just want to talk about our sample at Children North East, so the people that we have directly spoken to. So in terms of those one-to-one conversations, so we've spoken to currently 169 children and young people. And I say to date, that's because we do, over the next 2 or 3 weeks, have a few final groups that we're going to speak to, which will give us a good understanding of give us additional learning, of course. And that's specifically phase 2. An additional 30 have engaged specifically in phase 1. The other kind of research studies that have been carried out include kind of further or more children and young people. So these are specifically children and young people that we as a charity have directly spoken to. After today, and I'll mention this at the end, we are going to kind of ask people if they want to receive the report that's going to be produced in a few weeks or later in the month. Then you can kind of sign up to receive that report, and that will have further detail around some of this. So the children we're focused on is 4 to 18. And I want to be really clear, because I don't want to kind of, I am not claiming that what I'm presenting today is representative of all children and young people, of the hundreds of thousands of children and young people in the Northeast. What it does is it gives us a flavour and an understanding of some of the challenges that children and young people have faced as a result of a number of different studies. So I need to be really clear about that as we move on. So just to give you a flavour of some of the things, and these are more general findings from phase 1, as I described earlier. So what have children and young people found difficult? Trying to avoid COVID. Some of these are direct quotes, but they are more representative of wider discussions. I think that's really interesting that trying to avoid COVID, not going out for a meal for my birthday, and we'll come on to the impact of missed milestones and how children and young people have found that kind of, I guess, frustrating is the word, and you'll hear me use that word an awful lot, frustration, over the course of the next kind of 20 minutes or so. So real kind of mix of I hate everything about lockdown. I think we've got to acknowledge that children are different and will have had very different experiences. And then the hard thing is not going to school. And I think school is a recurring theme, whether it's about what's been difficult or what's important now. School is a recurring theme, and we'll come on and look in more specific detail at how school has been difficult or good for different children and young people. And here's a picture, a young girl finding it difficult to stay at home all the time in lockdown. And so she's drawn a wonderful picture to kind of like that. What's been good? We have to acknowledge what's been good. TikTok. I don't know how that ended up top of the list, but anyway, TikTok. Learning to ride my bike with Dad and playing in the back garden. I think they're really interesting, and a common theme has been that children and young people have appreciated family time. And again, we'll come on to that in a little bit more. The picture there, I don't know if you can really see it, but the picture is of a family sat round on a sofa together, and that is a child kind of depicting this is what they have found kind of good. I think that's lovely. However, we have had other children, and on a number of occasions, the response to that question was nothing, or in this case, just nothing. So some children and young people have not found this good, this situation at all, and have really struggled to find kind of, positives, I guess, throughout it. And then this core question of what's important now. You'll notice the first two are about going back to school. These were obviously gathered pre-September, and I think again the importance of school for children and young people has been absolute paramount. And we found that, playing with friends, the picture at the bottom, playing in the park, having to take care of my mum as she is pregnant, like, life goes on, doesn't it? And I think it's really important that life does, go on. And I love the picture at the bottom, particularly because whoever drew this picture agrees with my son in that fun has to be central. And I've not got it as a closing comment, but I feel as though that's a challenge to us straight away, isn't it? We need to make sure and consider how can we provide opportunities for fun for children and young people. So yeah, really, really important. So phase 2, and I've called it phase 2 plus, because phase 2 is our Children North East speaking to children and young people, but I've also drawn in some of the findings from those other research studies that have been taking place, so that we have a more rounded picture of what children and young people have experienced. I've separated it into 6 sections, as highlighted in the bullet points here. What we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to play a video because you've heard enough of me talking already, and we're going to actually hear from some children and young people, well, some young people talk of their experiences. I'm then going to share findings and some thoughts around the first 3. You're going to have a quick discussion in very small groups of 2 or 3, and then I'm going to share the other 3, and we're going to do the same. So that's kind of how we're going to move forward here. So first of all, though, as I say, you've heard an awful lot from me, and actually what we're here to do is hear from children and young people. And this is this video is put together by the BBC as a result and as part of the Youth Under Lockdown study that I mentioned earlier, and that we've seen the early findings from. So I'm going to click the button, and they're going to appear, and it's all going to work wonderfully.
Simple things like getting onto the bus and saying cheers to the bus driver after you get off the bus.
Like routine, like because you're waking up for school, so maybe just like the routine, or like being around people.
And they don't actually have any physical like contact with like friends. I think that's quite hard.
See my friends, to be honest.
You would FaceTime people and Skype people and Zoom for hours and hours. That's not the same as actually hugging someone.
I've been doing some cross stitching. I learned the cross stitch, which is not great.
Can't go outside and speak to another person. You just start there texting or sleeping or working.
And I can't go through away all those years of work because we're in a pandemic. I've got to screw my head on and buckle down and try and do the work.
I feel like it's out of my control because my internet's quite bad. So if I can't get the schoolwork done now, I won't get the possible best grade that I could get.
I can't sit in my mock exams because of Corona. So now my teachers will have to determine what kind of grade I'll get.
I do miss learning. I do miss like being with people in my class. I miss some of the teachers. Yeah, that's it. I think that's the most difficult thing. Not knowing what's going to happen in the future.
I think for a lot of you, it was quite difficult to kind of know whether we're going to have a job to
have this pressure that you're not allowed to go outside or be within 6 foot of people. That's a new type of pressure that can't be dispersed that easily.
I think it can really impact your mental health in a way, because there'll be some days when you just don't feel like getting up and out of bed.
I guess it would be like close together in a way, because like we spend more time around each other, so like we have more laughs and talk more.
I haven't quite come to this, so I'm happy that we get along quite well.
Yeah, it's like we're all chained together. There's nowhere you can really go without one another.
I'm just really concerned about like vulnerable people, such as like old people, for example, or people with underlying health conditions. Like, I don't mind being in lockdown as long as they're safe.
Then if you're gonna help save lives, then it's definitely worth it. I wouldn't like risk going outside for a pointless reason.
Ourselves as individuals can impact society in a big way, and Corona is helping us see that.
I think it's going back to how things went kind of thing. I don't think it's ever going to be quite back to normal, but it's normal as it can be.
Great. Hey, fab. I mean, really interesting, isn't it? Just hearing directly from young people, and hopefully already you're starting to think of some of the, some of those themes and some of those things that are coming out. But I want to share what we found so far, and I'm going to start with school and what we found about school. So first of all, as we go through this, I mean, please do consider what, how can we be creative? How can we respond to these findings? It's really important that we think in that way, I guess. But in terms of school, so first of all, really, really strong outcome from the consultation is that children and young people wanted to be back at school. So, and this is, at Children North East, we do an awful lot of work in schools and speak to thousands of children and young people, every year about school. It is not very common that we hear such positivity, particularly amongst teenagers, positivity at going back to school. And I think that's, there's an opportunity there, actually, I think. There are some difficulties of learning from home. And I think that's partly part of the contribution. So children have talked about being distracted by siblings, having to share devices. We know some of the challenges around that, which we've touched on, and not having the immediacy of support from teachers. So teachers having to kind of email a teacher and wait a day for a response and things like that, and some challenges there. So I think that's part of some of the challenges. Of course, that's still a challenge because children are still having to do home learning, whether that be because of self-isolation, or somebody in a year group or a bubble has got signs and symptoms. So it's important that we consider that and think about that within schools. But also within the school day, there's been some challenges within the new structures. So some examples of those challenges: lengthened lessons. So in some schools, instead of having 5 lessons a day, you'll have 3, and children really struggling with concentrating and being able to kind of fully engage within those lessons. So some of those changes. People being stuck in a bubble. And what that means is that some children and young people have talked about the fact that they are then not necessarily able to access the teacher that they would normally speak to if they were struggling. Also, they might not be in with their friends, and that can be seen as a negative. Although there's a lovely story of a young girl who talks about the fact that she was furious because her friends weren't in her bubble, but then kind of on reflection, she said, but actually I've had the opportunity to make new friends and meet new people. Something of the optimism of youth that was, how brilliant that we, that's the response to some of those challenges. And again, very practical stuff that we hear from children and young people: limited options for school dinners. So while in some schools we know have really cracked the fact that, providing hot dinners and a variety of different dinners, there's still many schools, and this has been made kind of clear in the press, actually, that children just getting maybe cold dinners and things that they wouldn't normally eat. And I've put as a bullet point, less of a rush. it's been really interesting that children, particularly outside of exam kind of years, so lower than year 10 maybe, children have talked about there being maybe less of a rush. You're not having to arrive at a set time. It's a bit more fluid, not feeling the same levels of pressure that they have to make kind of their progress targets within school. And actually children and young people really benefiting from that. I think that's a really interesting kind of way of looking at this you know, the school day as it is now. And maybe some opportunities there. And of course, children, you know, talking, and this will be no surprise, I'm sure, of concern around missed exams and uncertainty about the future. And I'll come on to some of the anxieties about the future in a minute. So there's some of the things around school that we have found, some real interesting things. I just kind of, I'm going to offer a couple of reflections, and these are my reflections, not from children and young people, and some imagine ifs. You'll see what I've done there. Imagine if, you know, in terms of how we can respond. So first of all, you know, isn't it great that children want to be at school? Let's just imagine what can we do as organisations, whether it's as schools or other organisations that support schools. You know, imagine if there's less pressure for children and more flexible school days. You know, the children have really, you know, found that a positive thing. So you know, is there something for us to learn there? You know, imagine if schools had the time to commit to listening to children and young people regularly. You know, I'm not suggesting that schools don't do that in any way, shape or form. What I'm suggesting is it's about having time and do that kind of, you know, deep listening of children and young people and allowing that to inform how our schools are run, because straight away we've got some very practical, real things that schools can take on moving forward. So that's schools. Hopefully there's some interesting things there to kind of to learn, to build on. Digital world. I'm going to make a bold claim. Young people that we've spoken to are sick of being online. You know, did we ever think we'd hear the words? Young people are sick of being online, and generally there's some nuances to that. This idea of social interaction, you know, children and young people tired of the Zoom calls, and it's, you know, that kind of what I know certainly from my perspective sometimes feels like artificial kind of conversations when you really want to sit down with somebody and have those you know, real face-to-face conversations. Children and young people are wanting face-to-face interaction. That, I think, presents a challenge for us, yes, but does it present an opportunity, and is there something there that we need to consider in terms of our response? At no point am I suggesting that after Thursday you go out and, you know, engage with children and young people in some capacity, because of course we can't do it for the next month, but let's plan for it. Let's put all the risk assessments and protocols and management things in place so that we can do that when the time comes. Let's consider that, because that's what children and young people are saying. What's really interesting, and I put gaming there very specifically because gaming is a key thing, and it's key for social interaction for young people particularly. It's part of the norm for young people to socially interact through gaming, and whether it be, you know, any age, children or young people, gaming was almost seen as different as that kind of online social interaction. It was almost seen as a separate thing. The Zoom call is very different to the gaming. Gaming was seen as a really real positive from a child and young person's perspective. So really, you know, for older young people, that's great, and there was lots of social interaction there. It was interesting for younger children, there wasn't necessarily as much social interaction. So, you know, you might be on Minecraft, but you'd be playing on your own. Whereas if you were older and playing a different, I don't know, a different game, and doing having some conversation or doing that with a friend, then there was a social element. But gaming definitely featured as a really kind of key thing, and an important thing actually for a number of children and young people. Schoolwork, and we've kind of touched on it already, but just the challenges of having devices or not having devices. And I want to extend that to broader than schoolwork. It's not just schoolwork, actually. You know, if we want to engage digitally with children and young people, it is the facility there for us to do that. And something certainly of the importance of regular contact with children and young people, the frequency of contact, whether that be with schools. But again, I think that there is some learning for all of us as organisations. How can we ensure there is a frequency of contact? And we may all have had some of these issues at some stage, but data running out, and certainly Wi-Fi dropping in and out, and I've had that issue certainly. But these are very real issues for children and young people. So let me imagine if, entertain me on this. Imagine if we could create more opportunities to engage with children and young people face to face. Imagine if we can provide IT equipment and connectivity for children and young people that don't have access to it. And actually, if you know of young people that you want to engage with that are in that situation, please get in touch with us at Children North East, and we may be able to help. And thirdly, let's really, let's really use our imaginations. Imaginations allow us to kind of see see the possibilities, I guess, as I see it. Can we engage young people through culture and education using gaming as some form of engagement technique? Do we need to think outside the box a little bit in relation to that? Some things to consider. And then the final section before we get a chance to have a bit of a kind of a breather, if you like, and just a quick reflection on these things, home and housing. So the experience of lockdown, this came out particularly strong to the youth under lockdown research, that the experience of lockdown is determined by the amount of domestic space available to them. And that I'll say that again. So the experience of lockdown was determined by the amount of domestic space available to children and young people. So the size of the house kind of did matter in relation to kind of what they were able to do. I mean, just look at the block of flats. If imagine a sunny day and being stuck in the block of flats and not being able to go into a garden or necessarily an outdoor space. Also, who was at home? So there was an awful lot of conversations about positive conversations about children bonding with family members, and that was definitely a recurring theme. So we've got to look at those positives because there's learning there as well. Children and young people do talk about being sick of one another, and again, many of you may relate to that. I'll not kind of pin my flag to the mast on that one. But I say these things because they've come out and children and young people have talked about them. I'm also aware of the predictions on the increased levels of domestic abuse that's been going on, and so I have to put that caveat in there. We know that there have been some significant challenges, but from the findings and from the conversations that we've had with children and young people, there has been some real kind of positivity about that bonding. However, there's been another side to that, which is this issue of attachment. So attachment issues on return to home, return to school, sorry. So not wanting to leave mum, for example, comments that come out. One of the children talked about the fact that dad going back to work was one of the most difficult parts of lockdown. So really interesting that we do need to consider that, and that's definitely something that's there as an undercurrent within our findings. And again, we may relate to it, but children frustrated, that word again, by limits placed on their lives. Just want to imagine if I've got here, you may have others, and I encourage you to, but actually, what we're saying is that space really matters in terms of the home environment, particularly during lockdown, and particularly, that's an issue over these coming 4 weeks. Is there anything we can do to use our spaces? We know that will be very limited over the next 4 weeks, but beyond that, use the spaces that we have within our organisations to help those who do have little or no space to be able to do activities, to engage with each other, to have family time, whatever it might be. So, without further ado, I'm going to fly into a very quick. I'm going to give you 3-minute reflection time. So we are going to go into groups of 3. You have 30 seconds to introduce yourselves to each other, and just a chance for each of you to give a kind of, something that's maybe come out so far that's made you think, oh, I can maybe learn something from that, or I need to consider that as we move forward and move away from this morning's session. So Danny will be putting us into groups, and very shortly you will all disappear into a very small group just to get some reflection time. Okay, I think everyone's back. So I am going to continue. Hopefully that there was some interesting discussions there, and that'll be the start, hopefully, of discussions moving forward. I'm going to come on to kind of quickly move on to the next section, which I highlighted, which is health and well-being. This is a really important one, and one that actually featured in lots of our comments that we put at the beginning. What's really interesting is that there was very clearly an anxiety, but an anxiety about the future, more so than necessarily the here and now. Certainly an anxiety about kind of about the future moving forward. So whether that be employment or exams, kind of attainment, what they're going to be able to achieve. So I guess some challenges there with us. But what's also interesting, certainly in the conversations that we've had at Children North East, we found something of the resilience of children and young people. There was very much an element of children and young people feeling as though they're dealing with the now. And I know there's been lots of kind of, we need to swoop in and offer support services, universally to everybody. I'm not suggesting that's wrong or that we shouldn't do that. But what I'm saying is that what we found from children and young people is that they talked very much about kind of, almost kind of getting on with it. So that's really kind of an important thing to note. The youth under lockdown definitely highlighted, though, that so this is older young people particularly, that lockdown had impacted badly on mental health, and we'll be able to dissect that a little bit more specifically. We do have a report that highlights these things. Access to support services has been limited. So health and welfare services, and that's, again, this is children and young people talking about that. Something there that we need to consider. And more widely, some kind of frustrations, so when we talk about health and well-being, children and young people have felt frustrated on the restrictions on their lives, frustrated on non-compliance of others. Again, I've had many conversations with adults who have those frustrations, and actually, children and young people equally have those. The rules, kind of not being able to see friends and such like, but actually, as a result of some of this, there's something, I'm going to call it a positive output, which is that children and young people seem to have a greater engagement with politics. I'm not necessarily talking about a deeper level of politics. It's amazing the number of children that have talked about the fact that Boris has told us that we're allowed to do this, or Boris has told us that we're not allowed to do this. I'm not going to kind of comment on anything, any of the kind of anything political as such, bar the fact that children and young people are engaged in something kind of political. And I see that as a good thing. And that's, personally, I see that as a good thing. And then health impacts. So older young people have talked about worrying about the virus, much less so with younger children, less worried about the virus. But universally, children and young people have talked about worrying around or feeling concern around their physical health. They've not been able to get out and do things that they normally would be able to do. And that's had an impact. So let me just imagine if quickly. So imagine if we could provide children and young people with some certainties in a future that's not certain. If I go back, that first point, anxiety about the future, is one that's kind of consistent. Is there anything that we can do within our organisations to offer some certainties I know that's a real challenge, but let's consider it and make sure that the support services are more accessible. I'm just going to touch on that a little bit more on this next section. This next section is cultural, leisure and social opportunities. So we've had, and this again may not be a surprise, but children and young people talked about limited opportunities. So charities and community organisations not engaging with children and young people, and that's something that's come from it. And I think you know, you understand that. I mean, all of us have organisations that have been trying to kind of fight our way through, and that's why it sometimes feels like, you know, this situation. And children and young people have been fighting their way through. And the last bullet point here I've put is kind of a lost connection, and I'm kind of, you know, getting this sense that children and young people are feeling as though, you know, bar school, which has been a constant, there's been lost connection with other things that have been going on. And actually, maybe there's an opportunity there for us to reconnect with children and young people, which I know is very difficult, but let's imagine that we can do that. Restrictions have been kind of frustrating. So I mean, we talk about leisure opportunities. So, you know, there's a year 11 group talked about the fact that they can't play football at lunchtime, their leisure and social time, because their bubble doesn't include the school field. So that has an impact. The restrictions of you know, not being able to help or see your friends after school. So you're in a bubble in school. You're allowed to kind of sit next to somebody in class, and then you walk out the school, and you can't, you know, if they're upset, you can't go and put your arm around them. This was a story of one young lad told. You know, so, you know, really interesting that's a frustration. But how great that children and young people have been trying new things. For me, there's an opportunity there. Children and young people are showing a willingness to engage in new opportunities. And we've heard stories of children trying baking, learning to draw, you know, cross stitch. I think it was in the video earlier, wasn't it? That, you know, Chantel talking about learning to cross stitch. I think let's use this as an opportunity. So let's, you know, this is all about bridging the gap. Let's make sure we can try and bridge the gap between children and young people and cultural engagement, leisure activities, social interaction. What can we do? How can we be more visible? And I think that that's a really important thing based on what's being found. How can we be more visible for children and young people? And then finally, three other kind of bullet points I just want to pull up. First of all, missed milestones. I mentioned it earlier. Missed birthdays, missed exams, missed meals out, you know, whatever it might be. Children and young people feel as though they have missed some milestones. Children and young people have also talked about this lack of clarity on rules. Right at the beginning, in terms of context, I talked about the different, you know, lockdowns that we've experienced. Children and young people not 100% clear on what they are and aren't allowed to do. And, you know, again, we may all sympathise with that, but that's their experience. So again, anything we can do to support them through that. And employment, and this there is some pessimism over future opportunities. This is a link to that anxiety about the future. There is something, I mean, very practical stuff. Sixth formers talking about the fact that they are not able to. So they were off. They were in lockdown, and the school were expecting them to do schoolwork, but because their work, particularly in retail, knew that they were off school, they were expecting them to go in. So these torn priorities. And of course, if you need the money, of which some families do, then you're going to choose the one that pays. So interesting impact there. But something just to be really clear: young people and parents who have lost jobs are feeling the pressure of financial problems the hardest and are having the greatest anxiety. And that's something that seems to be kind of running across different research studies. So let's finally imagine if we could direct support specifically to families who've lost their jobs or had family members lose their jobs. Is that a possibility? And let's, you know, can we create new milestones, celebrations, if you like, alongside children and young people? Some challenges there, hopefully, that we can respond to. Now, I would like to allow the opportunity for us to reflect some more, and I hope, you know, if you do want to do that reflection, please do put in your, you know, send a message to the people that are in your group, and please do kind of connect, have some discussions about this. But I'm conscious of time, and I want to kind of wrap up. And I want to wrap up with this, with essentially a bit of a challenge. So first of all, what now for your organisation? You've gathered some information, some findings from children and young people. What can you learn? What can you take from this? Is there something? And, you know, I always encourage people to write down the answers to some of these questions, or else it sometimes doesn't happen. But this is a presentation of research that's been carried out, and to see that research in its entirety, please do get in touch. We want to share that. So later this month, we will have kind of a report which will highlight the things that I've talked about here, and give some kind of, you know, more detailed context, of course, as reports do, around that. Please do email the email address here and request a copy of that report, and we will make sure that you go on the mailing list for that. I guess finally, how can you engage with children and young people locally to your organisation? I said earlier that this isn't necessarily representative of children and young people across the region. We just haven't got a big enough sample study to claim that. But what's really important for you as an organisation, I believe, is to continue an engagement and ongoing dialogue with children and young people, particularly now more than ever. I know it's hard, I know it's not easy, and if you want to talk about the methodology around that, or want to, you know, work with us, and we can kind of, you know, on those opportunities, and get in touch with myself or through the email address that we've got up here. But it's really important that there is this ongoing dialogue with children and young people, so we can continue to learn. You know, I've said there, the learning continues. And this is why it's important, because actually it's the right of the child to have an input into what goes on around them. And actually I say that, you know, we all make decisions and provide services and offer things to children and young people in the Northeast. And children have the right to say what they think should happen, what that support should look like, and around the decisions that are made that affect them. And also to have their opinions taken into account. Let's consider how we can continue to do that, particularly now, using maybe some of the things that we've learned from the research so far. And I've not got it written down, but let's consider how can we make sure that children and young people have the opportunity for some fun in amongst that. You know, the words of my son. So let's do that. So I hope that was useful insight. So some things, getting hold of some key findings at this stage, and hopefully that can inform and influence you as you move forward and consider how you can respond to COVID-19. But you know, I really want this to be the start of a dialogue and conversation with you guys. Please do kind of get in touch with myself, with us at Children Northeast. My details are there. We want to continue that engagement with children and young people and make sure their voice and their experiences are front and centre. And if you have any questions that we've maybe not been able to answer, or that you go away and think about, get in touch. My contact details are there. It's really important that we, you know, continue to work together to have the best outcomes for children and young people across our region. So apologies about going over, but thank you very much for your time. It's been great to share some of those findings, and I hope to hear from many of you soon.